The moment Isabella's champagne flute tapped against the crystal chandelier was the moment the timer started. A clear, ringing sound that silenced the entire ballroom, just as she'd intended. "A toast," she declared, her voice a syrupy confection of warmth that only fooled those who didn't truly know her. I felt my own hand tighten around my champagne glass, the delicate stem threatening to snap. My husband, Julian, was blissfully unaware, lost in some financier's joke from across the grand hall. At the center of it all stood Marcus Thorne, a man of 65 who wore his self-made empire with a quiet confidence that my father-in-law, Richard Davenport, could never replicate. Richard had inherited his fortune and expanded it through backroom deals, not genuine vision. To Marcus, Isabella went on, her ruby-red lips forming a curve that masqueraded as a smile. I knew what it really was. For bringing us all here tonight. Before we get into the heart of this, I want to take a second and thank all of you for being here for this story. If you find yourself captivated by tales of intricate payback and seeing the arrogant get what they deserve, maybe think about subscribing. It costs nothing, and you'll be helping me bring more stories to light about people who decide to fight back when they're pushed too far. Okay, now let's watch as Eleanor starts the clock on her sister-in-law's perfect life. The crowd let out a polite, appreciative murmur. This was the annual Apex Charity Ball, the absolute peak of our city's high society calendar. It was an event where multi-million-dollar contracts were solidified over dessert, and entire reputations could be shattered by a single, well-placed whisper. Although, Isabella added, her voice dropping into a dramatic whisper that still managed to carry across the polished marble, I have to say, the lighting in here is doing wonders for you tonight, Marcus. It almost hides that shiny spot on your head. A few nervous giggles rippled through the guests. What was it the Chronicle called you in that profile last month? The bald eagle of business? She gave a light, airy laugh, twisting a lock of perfectly highlighted blonde hair. Though I've always thought vulture might be a more fitting term, considering how you've been circling that Wilcox merger. The laughter died instantly. Several key investors from the Wilcox deal were standing just a few feet away. Marcus's recent acquisition had been aggressive, but flawlessly legal. I watched the blood drain from Richard's face as his daughter continued her verbal assassination, demolishing in mere seconds a business alliance he had spent years cultivating. "Isabella," I whispered, taking a step toward her. "That's enough." She paid me no mind, as usual. I was Julian's insignificant wife, the girl who hadn't been born with a silver spoon and, in her eyes, would never truly fit in. "To our bald vulture," she finished, raising her glass high. "May your talons never lose their grip." A wave of absolute silence crashed through the room. I met Marcus's eyes from across the sea of stunned faces. The look in his gaze was pure steel, cold, calculating, and suddenly profoundly dangerous. This wasn't just a social blunder. This was corporate suicide. Richard finally lurched into motion, crossing the room with a speed that defied his bulky frame. "My sincerest apologies, Marcus," he boomed, grabbing Isabella's elbow with a fury he barely managed to conceal. "My daughter's sense of humor occasionally gets the better of her sense of decorum." She meant no disrespect. "Of course not," Isabella cooed, her eyes telling a completely different tale. She had meant every single syllable. This was petty payback for Marcus declining her pitch to run the Thorne Foundation's marketing division the month before. She was a woman who could not tolerate being told no. "No offense taken," Marcus replied, his voice as cold as a glacier. "Though I would be careful with bird of prey metaphors, Ms. Davenport." Even vultures have their place in the natural order. The orchestra, desperate to break the suffocating tension, struck up a new tune. Julian finally materialized at my side, squeezing my hand, completely oblivious to the shockwaves vibrating through the air. "Is everything all right?" he asked with his usual cheer. "Perfectly fine," I lied, my gaze fixed on Richard as he practically dragged Isabella over to Marcus. Her apology was a masterclass in insincerity. "I am so terribly sorry if my toast was misconstrued, Marcus. You know how much I adore your unique profile." Marcus's nod was so rigid it looked painful. "Of course, Isabella. Your candor has always been your most memorable quality." That should have been the end of it. A clumsy social error, papered over with the thin veneer of high society politeness. But I had spent years watching the power dynamics in this world. I recognized the tremor that had just shot through the foundations of their carefully built alliance. "He will never forgive her for this," a voice murmured beside me. I turned to see Chloe Thorne, Marcus's daughter, and, unexpectedly, the only real friend I had in this den of sharks. Unlike the other heirs and heiresses, Chloe had genuinely earned her position in her father's company, starting in the mailroom despite her last name. "Your father is always a gentleman," I offered diplomatically. Chloe let out a delicate snort, guiding me toward the terrace doors. "In public, yes, but did you see his eyes?" Outside, the cool summer air was a welcome relief. The city glittered below, the distinctive spire of the Thorne Tower dominating the skyline. "Dad has been looking for an exit from his partnership with your in-laws for months," she confessed, her voice a bare whisper. "This merger with the Sterlings that Richard keeps bragging about. It's built on a house of cards. The only reason Dad hasn't pulled his support is because of the history between our families." I took in this new information, storing it away. It was a loaded weapon. For 3 years, I had tolerated Isabella's constant jabs, her subtle and not-so-subtle ways of reminding me that I was the scholarship girl who had lucked into marrying a Davenport, but would never truly belong. "Don't you dare repeat that," Chloe added quickly. "Dad would have my head." "But I thought you should be aware." Before I could say anything, the terrace doors burst open. Richard appeared, his voice booming with forced cheerfulness, his arms slung around Marcus's stiff shoulders. "The future is bright, isn't it, Marcus? Once we close this Sterling deal next month, we'll own the entire eastern seaboard." "Indeed," Marcus replied, his smile stretched thin. It didn't come close to reaching his eyes, the same eyes that had locked with mine earlier, filled with a quiet, burning rage. More people spilled onto the terrace as the charity auction concluded. Julian found me again, still floating in his bubble of carefree privilege, completely unaware that his sister had just pushed their family to the brink of a financial cliff. "Dad says we raised over $8 million tonight," he told me, beaming. "Isabella is already figuring out how to spin it for the wedding publicity." Of course she was. Isabella's impending marriage to the Sterling heir had zero to do with love and everything to do with merging two corporate empires. I just nodded and smiled, playing my part as the dutiful wife, while my mind was busy tracing the intricate web of lies and leverage that held this entire glittering world together. At precisely 10 o'clock, the fireworks began, bursting over the river in dazzling displays of light. As every face turned upward, I made my choice. 3 years. 3 years of being the outsider, of being tolerated but never welcomed. 3 years of watching Isabella casually destroy anyone who got in her way, armed with the cruelty of someone who has never once faced a real consequence. As the colors exploded overhead, Illuminating Isabella's smug, perfect profile, I made a silent vow. It wasn't a promise born of heat or anger, but a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in my chest. She would pay for her arrogance, not tomorrow, not next week, but at the perfect moment. I would remember Marcus's icy gaze, Chloe's whispered confession, and the fault lines running deep beneath the Davenport family empire. Isabella had no idea. But tonight, with one careless toast, she had planted the seeds of her own ruin. 2 months after the ball, heavyweight invitations arrived, announcing the engagement of Isabella Elizabeth Davenport to Mr. Alistair Sterling III. The envelope itself felt more substantial than my wedding band, the cardstock so thick it was practically a board. Julian brought it home, a mixture of excitement and anxiety on his face. "Mother says it's going to be the social event of the decade," he said, watching me trace the ornate script. "The media attention alone should bump the company stock by at least 5%. I placed the invitation on our kitchen island. How very romantic. Julian, as usual, missed the sarcasm. "Well, it's not just about romance, Ellie, is it? The Sterlings control the shipping logistics we need, and we have the distribution network they've been trying to build for a decade." He gave my cheek an absent-minded kiss. "It's a perfect match. Perfect for the balance sheets, maybe." I had only met Alistair Sterling twice. The first time was at a charity auction where he stared at his phone the entire night, and the second was at a Christmas party where he got so drunk he called his own sister by the wrong name. Not long ago, Isabella had referred to him as that pompous Sterling bore, but now, suddenly, he was the love of her life. The engagement party a week later was a grand affair at the Davenport family estate, a sprawling mansion with grounds so perfectly manicured they had been featured in several architectural digests. I chose to wear an emerald green dress, knowing full well it would clash with Isabella's request for all guests to wear pastels to match her blush pink gown. "You look gorgeous," Chloe whispered as she found me by the champagne fountain, and also like someone who conveniently missed the dress code memo. I gave her an innocent smile. "Was there a memo?" Chloe's laugh was a welcome sound. She was stunning in a silver gown that complemented the striking silver streaks in her hair, a trait she'd inherited from Marcus and wore with unapologetic confidence. "Dad sends his regrets," she said, her voice dropping. "A sudden business trip to Tokyo." "How very convenient." "Isn't it?" Her eyes glinted with mischief. He did, however, send a ridiculously expensive vase as an engagement gift, an antique from the Ming dynasty. "It's the ugliest thing I've ever seen, but it's worth more than our first car." Across the lawn, Isabella was holding court, her left hand artfully positioned to catch the light. The diamond on her finger was the size of a small planet, at least 12 carats, cushion-cut, with a halo of smaller diamonds. Alistair stood a step behind her, looking stiff and uncomfortable in his tuxedo, his eyes constantly darting back to his phone. "They look overjoyed," I murmured. "Oh, they're ecstatic," Chloe replied dryly. "About the stock options. Did you know the prenup talks took longer than their entire courtship?" The evening unfolded as expected. An endless parade of elaborate canapés, a string quartet playing soft, forgettable classical music, and a river of champagne. Richard tapped his glass for attention, his face flushed not with fatherly pride, but with pure triumph. "To new beginnings," he toasted, his eyes sweeping over the assembled business partners rather than the engaged couple. "And to the union of two great families and their enterprises." Polite applause rippled through the guests. I scanned the crowd, noting the mix of genuine well-wishes and blatant networking. My gaze landed on Mr. Sterling Sr., who was standing slightly apart from the main group. Despite the cool evening air, sweat beaded on his forehead as he scrolled frantically through his phone. He caught me looking, quickly pocketed the device, and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I excused myself from Chloe and made my way toward the bar, positioning myself just close enough to hear his hushed, urgent whisper to an associate. "I don't care what you have to liquidate. Just keep it quiet until after the merger is announced next week." I took a slow sip of my champagne, filing that little piece of information away. The foundations weren't just cracking anymore. They were starting to crumble. Later that night, as Julian and I drove home, his usual carefree attitude was gone. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "Is everything okay?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea of the answer. He hesitated. "Just business stuff. Nothing you need to worry about. I'm your wife, Julian. If something is wrong, I want to know." He let out a heavy sigh. "It's this merger. If the Sterling deal were to fall through..." He trailed off, then admitted, "Dad has leveraged almost everything on this. The wedding, the merger announcement, the expansion plans. It's all one big package. If one piece falls, the whole thing comes down." I put my hand on his. "I'm sure it will all work out." "Of course it will," he said, a little too quickly. "Isabella won't let it fail. She has the wedding planned down to the last rose petal." I didn't say anything about the sweat on Mr. Sterling's brow or his panicked phone call. Some things were better kept to myself. 3 days later, Chloe called me just after midnight. I slipped out of bed, leaving Julian sound asleep, and took the call in our home office. "Eleanor, sorry it's so late, but I thought you'd want to know." Chloe's voice was tight with a barely contained energy. "Dad's hit his breaking point with the Davenports. He's liquidating all his shares in their joint ventures. It's happening tomorrow afternoon." My heart started to pound. "Tomorrow? Are you sure?" "Positive. The paperwork is all signed. He's calling Richard at 2 p.m. to give him the news." She paused. "It's going to be a bloodbath. The market will react instantly." "What about the Sterling merger?" "That's the beauty of it. The whole thing is propped up by our company's backing. Once Dad pulls out, the entire house of cards is going to collapse." I closed my eyes, visualizing it. "The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night." "Is it?" Chloe's feigned innocence was terrible. What a truly unfortunate coincidence. After we hung up, I sat there in the dark. The possibilities unfolded in my mind like the final moves of a chess game. 3 years of quiet observation, of patient waiting, had all led to this single perfect moment. All the pieces were in place. Isabella's cruelty, Richard's arrogance, and their empire built on smoke and mirrors. I picked up my phone and found a number I rarely used. My finger hovered over the contact for a moment before I pressed call. Marcus Thorne answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" I chose my words with extreme care. "Chloe mentioned you were planning on making some significant business moves tomorrow." A beat of silence. "She shouldn't have shared that with you." "Probably not," I agreed. "But she did." And it got me thinking about timing. Timing. I traced a pattern on the desk, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "What if you were to move your timeline up? To tonight? To tonight? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Tonight, he repeated slowly. During the rehearsal dinner, you mean? I didn't have to confirm. I didn't need to say a word. Marcus let out a low chuckle that held no humor, only the sound of a master strategist recognizing another. You've always seen more than people give you credit for, haven't you, Eleanor? I observe, I said simply, and now you want to act. Justice delayed is justice denied, isn't that what they say? Another long pause. Then, I'll need to make some calls. Of course, I won't keep you. As I was about to end the call, his voice stopped me. Eleanor, why now? After all this time? I thought of Isabella's smirk at the gala, of years of quiet dismissals and public humiliations, of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. Let's just say, I replied, I believe in perfect timing. I ended the call and sat motionless in the dark. A quiet hum of anticipation buzzed under my skin. Tomorrow night, Isabella's flawless world was going to shatter into a million pieces, and I would be there to watch it all. I arrived at the rehearsal dinner the next night with Julian, wearing a simple midnight blue gown that was elegant but understated. Tonight wasn't about me. Tonight, I was just the quiet observer, the invisible hand that had set the whole thing in motion. The restaurant, an exclusive spot with a panoramic view of the city, had been booked for the private event. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light on the assembled elite, the Davenports, the Sterlings, and a hand-picked selection of their most important business associates. Isabella had orchestrated the seating chart with military precision. I noted, with a grim sense of satisfaction, that my place card was at the farthest table from the wedding party, tucked between two of their elderly great-aunts. I'll get them to change it, Julian offered when he saw, but I put a gentle hand on his arm. It's fine, I assured him. I'm perfectly happy right here. And I was. My position on the periphery gave me the perfect vantage point for the coming implosion. I discreetly checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. Marcus had confirmed via text that everything was in motion. His team had been quietly executing the share liquidation for the past 18 hours. Key financial news outlets had been tipped off, timed to break the story at exactly 8 p.m., just as Richard was scheduled to give his speech. The first course, a delicate seared scallop dish, arrived. I barely tasted it. My eyes were glued to the head table, where Isabella was preening in a silver dress, a diamond necklace glittering with her every breath. It was a pre-wedding gift from Alistair, though I suspected it was just another calculated investment, more collateral in a transaction they were calling a marriage. At 5 minutes to 8, Richard stood up, champagne glass in hand. The low hum of conversation faded as he cleared his throat. Distinguished guests, beloved family, he began, his voice full of the practiced confidence of a man used to commanding a boardroom. We are gathered here tonight on the eve of a truly momentous occasion. Not just the union of two people, but the joining of two great legacies. I took a small sip of my wine, savoring the moment. Tomorrow, when Isabella and Alistair say their vows, they will be cementing more than just their love. They will be forging the future, a future of prosperity, growth, and... His phone buzzed loudly on the table. Richard frowned, glancing down at the screen. His expression remained smooth, but I saw the muscles around his eyes tighten. He silenced the device and tried to continue. As I was saying, a future of unprecedented opportunity for... The phone buzzed again, and then it wasn't just his phone. A wave of vibrations and chimes swept through the room as everyone's devices came to life. Alistair's father, Mr. Sterling Sr., was the first to look at his screen. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving him pale and ashen under the chandeliers. "Richard," he interrupted, his voice a strangled whisper. "The stock." The rest of his sentence was drowned out as Richard's own phone rang, a specific, urgent ringtone he used only for his most critical advisors. With a strained smile, he excused himself. "One moment, please. I'm sure this is nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Through the glass partition of the private dining room, we could all see Richard's face transform, disbelief, then rage. It was like watching a statue crack from the inside out. He reappeared a moment later, his face a mask of fury. "What do you mean he's withdrawn?" His shout silenced the orchestra. The glass he was holding shattered on the marble floor. "That's impossible!" The paperwork wasn't final until next week. The room froze. Isabella's hand flew to her throat, clutching her diamond necklace as if it were suddenly choking her. "Father." Her voice held a note I had never heard before, pure, unadulterated fear. Richard ignored her. He was screaming into his phone, spittle flying from his lips. "Call him back! You tell Thorne he can't do this. The announcement is Monday." The name Thorne sent a ripple through the room. Guests started frantically checking their own phones. Gasps and shocked murmurs grew into a chorus of disaster. "Davenport Holdings plummets 43% in after-hours trading," someone read aloud. "Thorne Consolidated severs all ties with Davenport Holdings effective immediately," another voice added. "Sterling Global expected to withdraw from merger talks." Mr. Sterling Sr. swayed, his face turning from white to a concerning shade of gray. He reached for the table to steady himself, missed, and collapsed face first into his own chocolate dessert. The chaos that erupted was a beautiful thing to behold. Waiters rushed to Mr. Sterling's side while panicked business associates huddled in corners, making frantic calls to their brokers. The orchestra, completely lost, began to play a somber, funereal tune that only made the disaster feel more complete. Through it all, Isabella stood frozen, the horrifying realization finally dawning on her perfect face. This wasn't a business problem. This was the end of her entire world. "The wedding," she whispered, then louder. "The wedding." What about the wedding? Alistair was already on his own phone, his back to his fiancée, barking orders at his own team. His body language said it all. When it came down to a choice between Isabella and his family's fortune, it was no contest. Isabella's composure finally snapped. She lunged at Julian, who was watching the scene with the same stunned look as everyone else. "Do something!" she shrieked, her manicured nails digging into his arm. "Call your contacts." "Call someone. This can't be happening." Julian looked helplessly from his hysterical sister to his father, who was now slumped in a chair, phone pressed to his ear, begging his lawyers for an option that didn't exist. "I don't think there's anything we can do, Bella," he said softly. "If Thorne pulled out, I don't care what he did." Her voice rose to a shrill pitch that made the crystal glasses vibrate. "Fix it." I stayed in my seat, calmly raising my wineglass to my lips. Across the chaotic room, our eyes met, hers wild with desperation, mine steady with cold satisfaction. For a fleeting second, a flicker of suspicion crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by fresh panic as Alistair's father regained consciousness and immediately started screaming at his own broker. By midnight, the restaurant was empty. The Sterlings had left in a grim procession, Alistair trailing his family without a single backward glance at his now ex-fiancée. The business associates had vanished, eager to put distance between themselves and the imploding Davenport empire. Only the immediate family remained, shell-shocked. Julian and I went back to the Davenport estate with Richard and Isabella. The house, filled with floral arrangements for the next day's garden ceremony, felt like a mausoleum. Isabella fled upstairs while Richard locked himself in his study with a bottle of scotch. The inevitable announcement came with the dawn. The wedding was officially canceled. I found Isabella in her room, surrounded by wedding gifts that would all have to be returned. Her custom designer gown hung on the closet door, a mocking specter of white silk. She wore no makeup, and her hair was a tangled mess. When she looked at me, her eyes were red, but I knew she wasn't crying over a lost love. She was crying for the empire that had just slipped through her fingers. "Are you happy now?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. I leaned against the doorframe. "Why would I be happy your wedding was canceled?" Her laugh was bitter and hollow. "Don't play dumb. I saw your face last night. You enjoyed every single second of it." I didn't bother to deny it. Some truths are so obvious they don't need to be spoken. I left Isabella's room without another word. There was nothing left to say. We both knew what had happened, even if she couldn't yet grasp how I had orchestrated it. In the hall, I almost ran into Julian. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink. "Dad's in the study," he said, his voice rough. "He's been on the phone with Marcus Thorne all night." I nodded, feigning sympathy. "Any progress?" Julian raked a hand through his hair. "None. Thorne won't even take his calls. Dad has offered him everything. A bigger share, board seats, even naming rights on the new headquarters." And Thorne's response? He just keeps having his assistant refer to some formal letter his legal team sent. Apparently it states that, effective immediately, all ties are severed. No negotiation, no transition, just over. From downstairs, we heard the sharp crash of something shattering. Richard's temper was finding a physical outlet. I winced, and this time it wasn't entirely an act. That house had been in the family for generations, filled with priceless antiques. "The stock is still in freefall," Julian continued, checking his phone. "Down 62%. The financial news is calling it Black Tuesday." He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot. "We're ruined, Eleanor. Completely ruined." I put a comforting hand on his arm. "Not ruined, just changed. You don't understand. Everything, this house, the vacation homes, even our personal accounts were all tied to company stock. Dad leveraged every last asset for the Sterling deal. Everything." "Everything?" I asked, my voice colored with genuine surprise. I had expected damage, but not total annihilation. Julian nodded grimly. "The prenup with the Sterlings took so long because Dad was hiding just how bad our liquidity problem was. They wanted financial guarantees we couldn't provide without the merger itself going through." Another crash echoed from downstairs. We both glanced toward the sound, then back at each other. "You should try to get some sleep," I suggested. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." "Tomorrow," Julian laughed, a hollow, empty sound. "Tomorrow we start selling off assets to pay creditors. Tomorrow the board will meet to demand Dad's resignation. And tomorrow our lawyers are meeting with the SEC to answer questions about an anonymous insider trading complaint that was mysteriously filed." I kept my face a perfect mask of neutrality. The SEC complaint had been Chloe's idea, a little flourish I hadn't even known about until it was done. As Julian turned to leave, he paused, studying my face with a new, unnerving intensity. "You knew this was going to happen." It wasn't a question. His eyes, so much like his father's but warmer, more perceptive, held mine. In that instant, I realized he had always been far more observant than anyone gave him credit for. "Not exactly," I said carefully. "Not the full scale of it. But you knew something was coming." He took a step closer. "When the deal collapsed, you weren't surprised. You were ready." I held his gaze, neither confirming nor denying. After a long moment, a strange look crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was something closer to respect. "Remind me never to underestimate you," he said quietly, before continuing down the hall to his old childhood bedroom. The week that followed was like watching a slow-motion demolition. The business world watched, captivated, as the media documented every excruciating detail of what they called the Davenport collapse. Lawsuits from investors piled up. The board officially forced Richard to resign. The family's private jet was seized by creditors, forcing them to fly back from a trip on a commercial airline in coach. Bianca's social death was, perhaps, the most spectacular part. The same so-called friends who had been fighting for a spot in her wedding party were suddenly unavailable to take her calls. Invitations to social events mysteriously dried up. Her once fawning social media pages became digital ghost towns. 10 days after the disastrous rehearsal dinner, I went with Julian to the family lawyer's office. The mood in the conference room was somber. "The Manhattan apartment has to be sold," the attorney said, sliding documents across the table, "along with the property in the Hamptons and the Napa Vineyard." Richard, looking small and defeated in a rumpled suit, just nodded. Isabella, however, was not going down without a fight. "What about my personal assets?" she demanded. "My jewelry collection alone is insured for over $8 million. The lawyer cleared his throat. "I'm afraid most of that collection was acquired with corporate funds. Those items are being inventoried for liquidation." "That's not possible!" Isabella slammed her hand on the table. "My diamond parure was a gift from my father. A gift that was purchased through the company as a tax write-off," the lawyer corrected gently. When we left, Isabella was still arguing, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. Julian and I rode the elevator down in silence. "Will you stay?" he asked suddenly as the doors closed. "With me, I mean, now that all this—" He gestured vaguely. I took his hand. "Did you think I married you for your money?" "I wouldn't have blamed you if you did," he said with a sad smile. "It's what everyone else seemed to want from us." "I'm not everyone else." The truth was more complex. I hadn't married him for his money, but I hadn't exactly married him for love either. Not at first. I'd married him because he was kind in a family that was cruel, because he saw me when everyone else looked right through me. The love had come later, quiet and steady, and now, watching him face this catastrophe with a dignity his father and sister lacked, I realized that love had deepened into something real and unshakable. 2 days later, Chloe took me to lunch at a quiet restaurant far from the financial district. "To the architect of the most elegant takedown I have ever witnessed," she said, raising her water glass. "I honestly never knew you had it in you." I smiled faintly. I had a good consultant. Dad just provided the ammunition. You were the one who knew the perfect moment to pull the trigger. From her purse, she took out a small velvet pouch. "I brought you something." Inside was a string of flawless South Sea pearls. I recognized them instantly. Isabella had worn them to my wedding. "How did you—" "They were part of the asset liquidation. Dad's company acquired them, and he thought you might appreciate them." Chloe's smile was wicked. "A little trophy for the victor." We shared a laugh, though mine felt a little hollow. Revenge, I was learning, wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined. It didn't erase years of being made to feel small. It just balanced the scales. The following weekend, I went back to the Davenport estate one last time. Movers were packing the last of the family's possessions. Isabella was gone, rumored to have taken refuge at a distant cousin's guest house in Connecticut. In the master bedroom, the safe was open and empty, except for a few pieces of jewelry that had been deemed Richard's personal property. I recognized a few items he'd given Isabella over the years. With the movers busy downstairs, I gathered the remaining pieces: a diamond bracelet, sapphire earrings, an emerald pendant, and slipped them into my purse. That evening, I made an anonymous donation to the children's cancer charity that had hosted the fateful gala. I included a note specifying that the jewelry be auctioned at their next fundraiser. The irony was delicious. The very symbols of Isabella's status would now fund the cause she had only ever used as a prop for her social climbing. As I walked away from the courier service, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The Davenport empire was gone, but from its ruins, something more honest might grow. For Richard, perhaps a lesson in humility. For Isabella, maybe a dose of reality. For Julian, freedom. And for me, a quiet victory, yes, but more importantly, closure. The scales were finally balanced. 3 weeks after the collapse, Julian and I moved into a modest brownstone in Brooklyn. It was a world away from the penthouse we once shared, but as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, it felt full of promise. It was the first home either of us had ever had that wasn't tied to the family fortune. "It's small," Julian said apologetically as we carried in boxes. "It's ours," I corrected him. "Truly ours." We were starting over. Julian had taken a job teaching at a local business school. It was a huge step down in pay and prestige, but his eyes lit up when he talked about it, excited by the idea of shaping minds without his father's shadow hanging over him. I was surprised when Richard asked to visit a month later. He arrived looking like a completely different person. The designer suit was gone, replaced by simple khakis and a button-down shirt. His whole demeanor was less commanding, more human. "Nice place," he said, looking around our living room without a hint of his old condescension. Julian had been called away for a last-minute faculty meeting, so Richard and I were left alone with a pot of coffee. The silence was awkward until he finally cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Eleanor." I raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. "When Julian first brought you home, I saw you as..." He trailed off, searching for the right word. "Beneath us," I supplied. He nodded, his honesty surprising me. "I was wrong. You were the only one who ever saw us for what we really were, who saw Isabella clearly." Hearing her name sent a pang of something, not quite guilt, but close to it, through me. "How is she?" I asked. He looked down into his coffee, struggling. "She's not adjusting well to a smaller life. Her cousin Marcus offered her a teaching position at that finishing school he runs in Switzerland." Richard's laugh was humorless. "Isabella teaching etiquette. The irony is not lost on me." At 28, she was essentially being exiled. "I indulged her far too much," he admitted quietly. "After her mother passed away, I thought giving her everything she wanted would make up for what she'd lost. I could have offered platitudes, told him he did his best, but some truths need to be unvarnished." "Yes," I said simply. "You did." He nodded, accepting it with a strange grace. When he left, his shoulders seemed a little lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. That night, Julian came home late, smelling of coffee and chalk dust. He sat on the edge of the bed where I was reading. "Dad told me about your talk," he said. "He also told me something else. Apparently, Marcus Thorne approached him 2 years ago about dissolving their partnership amicably. Dad refused. He tried to use the partnership to leverage more control. That sounds like him, I said. The thing is, Julian continued, studying my face, Thorne specifically mentioned his concerns about how Isabella treated you. He said it reminded him of how his late wife was treated by her in-laws. I kept my expression blank. That's interesting. Dad thought it was just a negotiation tactic, but now he wonders if Thorne was just waiting for the right reason or the right person to give him an excuse to finally cut the cord. His eyes held mine. You didn't just make a phone call that night, did you, Eleanor? You were playing a much longer game. I didn't answer right away. Does it matter? I asked softly. No, he said after a moment, except I'm realizing I never really knew you at all. A slow smile spread across his face, a mixture of awe and a little bit of fear. You're terrifying, and I love you for it. He kissed me, and in that moment, something shifted. The last of the pretense fell away, leaving behind something raw, honest, and far stronger for having been tested by fire. The next morning, a courier delivered a small, flat box. Inside was a vintage fountain pen in a leather case, with a handwritten note on heavy cardstock. Eleanor, this pen belonged to my father. He built our company from nothing and taught me that true power isn't about status, but about patience and precision. You remind me of him. Your father would be proud. Regards, Marcus Thorne. Coming from a man as reserved as Marcus, it felt like the highest possible praise. My own father, an ethics professor who passed away before I met Julian, would have been conflicted by my methods, but he would have understood the justice at its core. I was turning the pen over in my hands when my phone rang. It was Chloe, calling from her father's office, where she had taken on a much larger role. Are we still on for lunch tomorrow? She asked. Of course. Usual place. Perfect. She paused. I heard Isabella is off to Switzerland, teaching at a finishing school of all things. So I've heard. Chloe's laugh crackled over the phone. I would pay an obscene amount of money to watch Isabella Davenport try to teach anyone manners. We chatted for a few more minutes, and just as we were about to hang up, her tone changed. Eleanor, one more thing. Yes? What you did, it was justified, but be careful. Of what? Of becoming the thing you fought against. The warning was gentle, but the message was clear. Revenge can change you if you let it. After we hung up, I went to my jewelry box and found the diamond earrings I'd kept from Isabella's collection. Not to wear, but as a reminder. I held them up, watching the light fracture and dance on the wall. Chloe was right. The line between justice and vengeance is razor thin. I had brought down an empire with surgical precision, but I didn't want their brand of cruelty to become my own. I closed the box, but I kept the earrings. A reminder not of victory, but of the vigilance it takes to not become the monster you set out to destroy. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring. Victor flourished in his new academic life, and I found a quiet satisfaction in the simple, honest life we were building. One evening, he surprised me. I had lunch with Marcus Thorne today, he said casually. He's interested in backing a new venture. With us. A week later, we were in Marcus's penthouse office. The landscape has changed, he said, spreading papers on his desk. There's a void where Davenport Holdings used to be. A void for a company that values ethics as much as profit. You think we can fill it? I asked. Marcus's smile was shrewd. I think you already have the blueprint. He was right. I had spent years mentally cataloging every mistake the Davenports had made. We'd start small, Julian cautioned. Small, but significant, I agreed. Ideas already blooming. Focus on sustainable growth, transparent practices. Build something that can't be brought down by a single bad deal. And just like that, Horizon Partners was born. A year later, we were celebrating the firm's first anniversary at a rooftop bar. Chloe, who had just been named the new CEO of Thorne Consolidated, raised her glass. "To the new CEO," Victor toasted. Zoe's smile was radiant. "Dad's not fully retiring, but the day-to-day is mine now." Our new partnership with Horizon was the first thing the board approved under my leadership. As we talked, I marveled at how she wore her new power. It was a kindness backed by strength, not a cruelty born of insecurity. "By the way," she added casually, "I'm getting married." The announcement was so simple I almost missed it. "To whom?" "James Porter. He teaches literature at Columbia." It wasn't a merger or an alliance. It was just love. On a perfect June day, we gathered in the sculpture garden at the Met for the wedding. Zoe was glowing, her hand in her father's as he walked her down the aisle. Marcus, looking older but content, beamed with pride. "Never thought I'd see a Lambert marry for love instead of leverage," he murmured to me at the reception. I watched Zoe and James dance, their movements natural and in sync. "Times are changing," I said. "Thanks in no small part to you," he acknowledged. Later, I stood with Zoe by a fountain, watching the celebration. "Remember when we met?" she asked. "At that awful Christmas party where Isabella spilled wine on you?" I laughed softly. How could I forget? You showed up out of nowhere with club soda and a knowing smile. I recognized a kindred spirit, Zoe admitted. Someone who saw the game but wasn't corrupted by it. Look where it got us. I followed her gaze to Julian, animatedly talking to James about some obscure poet. To Richard, showing a retired judge photos of his community garden project. To Marcus, watching his daughter with pure happiness. "Karma doesn't forget an address," I whispered, an old saying of my father's. Zoe squeezed my hand. Neither do friends. As another song began, Julian appeared at my side, his hand outstretched. I stepped into his arms, moving across the floor with the easy grace of two people who had weathered a hurricane and come out stronger on the other side. The past was gone, and the future unfolded before us, bright and clear and entirely our own.